Good morning. Hi, for those who don't know me, my name is Lauren Paget. I'm SSDP's Development Director. I have the second best job in the world after Betty Aldworth. And thank you so much for being here. I know many of you had a rough journey with this uncharacteristic windstorm here in Maryland. I'm from Maryland. I've never seen this before in my life, but you made it through despite all obstacles. Unfortunately, Cassandra Frederick was also caught up in the weather, and she won't be able to join us today. Really bummed to miss out on hearing her speak, but we've already asked her to put SSDP 2019 onto her calendar. So instead of hearing from Cassandra, we are going to hear from our very own Betty Aldworth, and I'm so happy that I get to introduce her instead of follow her. If you are feeling short on inspiration, that will not be the case for much longer. What can I say about Betty? Like, the moment I met her, I wanted her to be my boss. She's been an activist since she could walk, and she strives for justice and compassion in everything that she advocates for and organizes. Leadership is so important to movements, and Betty has been such an awesome leader because she is all about making space for your voices to be heard the loudest. And when people ask, why is SSDP so awesome? How have you managed to accomplish so much? It's just what we do, and what Betty does is make space for us to do exactly that. So we're going to hear from Betty about how student movements have brought about social change throughout history and become inspired to go out and make history of our own. All right, everybody, Betty Aldworth.
Good morning, everyone. Believe it or not, this is the first time I've ever keynoted an SSDP conference, and thank you. I've been thinking about this talk for a long time, but I started writing it at 2 a.m. when I found out I was doing this. So bear with me. We're going to be a little bit rough around the edges, but this is real, right? This is what we do. We figure it out. We're SSDP. We take whatever challenges are presented to us. We acknowledge the problems when they come up. We see with clear eyes what needs to be fixed, and we fix it, right? That is what we do. I know that so many of you have done that in your own chapters, in your own experiences. I hear stories and report backs from your events, from your regional conferences. We have Lewis and Elise, Tyler and Jake tell us all the time about hey, they solved this problem. Hey, they figured it out. Hey, they got it done. It is what we do. We make change. We fix things. And we come from a long, long, long legacy of people who do just that. Every major social movement in the history of social movement has had students and young people involved, critically involved, not just involved on the fringes, critically involved. We are the movers. We are the people who are standing at the front of that vanguard. Anytime you see a group of people who are talking about a future, students are going to be there. And it's not always great, right? Students were involved in, heavily involved in student movements in Germany in the 30s in support of Nazis and Adolf Hitler. It's not always awesome, right? Let's acknowledge that straight out front. Students were the ones marching with their tiki torches in Charlottesville just less than a year ago. But more often than not, y'all are at the front of just the right things. Y'all are at the front of movements for justice, movements for equity, movements for democracy, movements for human rights. Those movements which push our world forward. And your vision for what that looks like is one of the most important pieces to informing that vision for the rest of us. So when I say you come from a long legacy, I mean it. The very first student movement in the history of student movements was in 1229, the Towns and Gowns in Paris, leading to the Saint Scholastica Day riots. Yes, 1229, when students and townies were clashing over a bar tab, but let's not split hairs here, all right? However, those very first clashes led to demands for better rights for students in these towns in France back in the 13th and 14th centuries. We have a long international history of student movements. In fact, did you know that the Tiananmen Square demonstrations were designed and led and implemented by students, fully changing the way that we view China and the rest of the world and shifting dramatically the Chinese political system? It's not just in China. We also saw students heavily involved in ending apartheid in South Africa. In 1976, the Sowego Day riots, if I remember correctly, pardon, again, 2 a.m. started writing, and some of the details are fuzzy, were instrumental in really driving, catalyzing, activating the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. As an aside, one of the first movements that I worked in on my own as an activist was the anti-apartheid movement. I was 14. I would have my mom drive me into town for 45 minutes so that I could sit for a couple of hours and write letters. Now, my letters did not change the world at the time, but when apartheid fell, just a year later, you better believe I thought I had a lot to do with it. And I think that that's an important thing, right? Like, all of you are sitting here because you figured out that you can make some change. And so I just, think about those early victories that you had and what they mean to you. Let them fuel you when you feel a little bit tired, right? The movement for Indian independence also included an incredibly important student contingent, led very strongly by young people in India. And let's turn now to the United States. The very first student protest in the United States was, yes, the Harvard Butter Rebellion. In the late 1700s, students at Harvard were dissatisfied with their butter in the dining hall. They were all dining together. I know, the butter, of all things. They stood up, they demanded that they have better butter. The administration cracked down, insisting that they give up the leaders of the Butter Rebellion, but nobody snitched. Nobody snitched. They stuck together. There we go. They stuck together, and what did they get at the end of the day? Better butter. Yes, they got their butter, ladies and gentlemen. They got their butter. So this is the very first student demonstration in the United States, and we're going to jump ahead, about 200 years. Because, of course, the civil rights movement required, in so many ways, the engagement of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Everybody's familiar with SNCC? Well, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about them. SNCC was an incredibly critical part of the civil rights movement in the United States. SNCC members were among the first to sit at lunch counters during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. They were the riders. They rode the buses on the Freedom Rides during the summers to end segregation on public transportation. They were the ones who went into the public libraries, used public parks, went into public swimming pools that were segregated, and demanded that those public facilities be open to both whites and blacks, oftentimes leading to those public facilities being closed rather than allowing African Americans to use them. They were the ones who participated heavily. They were the ground forces, the organizing forces for the March on Washington, the March on Selma. They were the ones who were putting their bodies on the line in direct action to make sure that the arguments being made in all of the other spaces, with Martin Luther King's groups, with all of the other organizing groups, to ensure that the arguments being made were supported by direct action, demonstrating that, in fact, people ought to be able to sit at a lunch counter, regardless of the color of their skin. demonstrating that people ought to be able to sit wherever they want on the bus. We all, I'm sure, have become familiar with the stories of the civil rights movement. And I think that, when you look at any of these movements, whether it be Tiananmen Square, whether it be the anti-apartheid movement, whether it be the civil rights movement in the United States, as young people fighting to make a change, I encourage you to look a little bit deeper and see who it is who's actually sitting there with their bodies on the line. Because so often it's your colleagues, your peers, the students who are there. And they go from being young student organizers, putting their bodies on the lines, taking those risks, registering voters when they know that what might happen is the end result, the consequence of that might be death, might be that they are murdered, literally. They go from that to become incredible icons of later movements. Of course, we have so many members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee who became leaders and still are in the American political system, the American civil justice, social justice movement, and folks who are fighting for racial justice today. Marion Barry, Ella Baker, Diane Nash. These are all names that many of you will recognize. But of course, our US representatives, Eleanor Holmes Norton and John Lewis. All of those people are out of SNCC. All of those people began organizing when they were young people, when they were students themselves. And I hope that that inspires you to think about what you might be able to accomplish as drug policy reformers, as human rights activists, as anti-incarceration fighters, whatever it is that brings you here today. Think about the legacy that you're coming from, because it includes SNCC in the civil rights movement. Of course, the Vietnam War protests, those were that's the one, that's the only one that we're like, oh yeah, student movement, right? But every single social justice movement, every single step forward that we have taken as humanity has required young people to stand at the front and build a vision for a better world. Build something different that we can aspire to. Something that the rest of us, the olds like me, can see as worth striving for. I want to talk specifically about why students are so important here. Why students are so important in these movements. It's because you all can do some things that the rest of us can't, right? You all have the ability to take additional risk. In fact, many of you hunger for it. It gives you a little bit of a thrill, right? Like, we can admit it, it's okay. You are able to take those summers off and go ride on buses and demand that we see some change from that. If we look at the freedom rides in the 60s, you all are able to go out and march. You have an extended ability to remove yourselves from the day-to-day because you don't yet have the things that hold so many of the rest of us down. You are able to go out and engage in the sorts of activities that we are not. And oftentimes, pardon me, I don't mean this in any sort of patronizing way, but y'all aren't thinking as much about what the results might be. And that's kind of okay. That's what we're here for. That's why we protect you with having lawyers' numbers on hand and knowing that if something happens when you're in demonstration, you can call SSDP and we're going to stand behind you, right? That's my job, is to make sure that you're protected. Your job is to go out there and figure out what it is that needs to be done and put yourself in a space where you're taking those sorts of risks, because you can, because you desire it, because it's easier for a student to do, easier for a young person to do, than it is for many of us who have been doing this work for a very, very long time. And yeah, we'll stand behind you, I promise. Civil disobedience is just such an incredibly important part of any sort of social change. Making sure that we are going out there and saying, listen, we see it so much in our own movement. with needle exchange, with provision of naloxone even when it's illegal, when we're providing underground safe spaces for people to inject, when we're giving people drug checking kits, when we are engaging in all of these different pieces of civil disobedience that require us to do things illegal because it is how we protect ourselves and our communities. Those actions demonstrate, they physically, literally show people that we can do better with harm reduction than we can through prohibition. And that comes from this long history of all of these social movements where we have young people sitting at those lunch counters, registering voters, opening up their own freedom schools in order to make sure that their communities are protected. We are doing the same thing. You also have extraordinary flexibility and adaptability. That's where that phrase comes from, right? That we're SSDP, it's how we do. It's because you have the imagination to come up with answers to problems, to adjust in the moment, to fix things when they go wrong. Your imagination works better than my imagination. That's just brain science, right? You have the ability to figure those things out. And when given the tools to do so, supported with resources by those of us in the community who have been at it for a long time, who can talk to you about the history of this movement, you are able to take those changes, those ideas, and turn them into something so incredibly powerful. And we love watching it. We love supporting it. That is the most wonderful part of the work that I do, is watching you all fix problems. I just love it. Okay, it's the second most wonderful part, because the really, truly most wonderful part is vision. You all have a vision for the future that is so much more radical than even the radical vision that the rest of the drug policy reform movement has for us. You are demanding things that go so far beyond what the rest of us can see. You are the ones who are saying we must have an equitable cannabis industry that acknowledges the harms of the war on drugs. You are the ones who are saying black and brown people have to be represented. You are the ones who are saying we need to do drug checking. We need to do drug checking everywhere. We need to make sure that people are not exposed to adulterated drugs. And we need to do everything we can for that. You are the ones who are saying that psychedelics are going to open our minds to new ideas that are going to create for us, perhaps even a new society. And who knows if any of it is, well, we know that most of it is true. But I'm a little bit on the fence about the everybody should do psychedelics thing. But the rest of it, you're the ones. You're the ones who are creating that vision. And if you look to our great leaders in this movement, the Eric Sterlings, the Ethan Nadelmans, the Rick Doblins, the Amanda Rymans, the Cassandra Frederiks. If you look to the great leaders in our movement, these are all people who had a vision when they were students, when they were young. They mapped it. They saw a theory of change. They decided how they were going to go about it. And today they are the elders of our movement, and they are creating for us that platform from which we can build the world that we envision, that is even more radical than Rick Doblin's. Are you ready? Are you ready to build that world with us? So here's what I want you to think about. Here's what I want you to think about all weekend long. Here's what I want you to go home with on Monday. Ready for? What are you going to bring? What are you going to bring to this movement? What vision are you going to create for us? How are you going to become part of this extraordinary new world? How are you going to make it your own? And how am I going to support that? How are Jake and Elise, Tyler and Lewis, Stacia and Lauren, Scott and Ville-Marie, how are we going to make it happen for you? How are you going to make it happen for you, more accurately? But how can we support you? What can we do? What is it that you want to see? And how are we going to create that vision together? I'm so excited to know what it is. I'm so excited to hear what you have to say. And I can't wait to hear what you are going to bring. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time this morning. I really appreciate it.